Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Metin Gürkan. I'm the Director of Center for Artificial Intelligence Research, and I would like to welcome you to our special seminar today. It's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Brian Chapman. He's an associate professor in the School of Computing and Information Systems at the University of Melbourne. And then his presentation today is titled Pushing Against Ignorance, Medical Informatics, Artificial Intelligence, and the Quest to Improve Healthcare. And then in this talk, he will explore how medical informatics seeks to create improved epistemic habits in healthcare through the development and implementation of information technologies. Are you going to explain epistemic habits? Because I had to study that myself.
If I don't, interrupt me, and I will. Glad to say what I think.
Okay.
Think by it.
Steve actually has a course on decision analysis, but I think part of this epistemic work will be related to that. And then, with a background as a medical informaticist and personal experience as a patient, Dr. Chapman is passionate about empowering patients to be informed and knowledgeable pilots of their healthcare. And then through his research and teaching, Dr. Chapman aims to improve healthcare experience through artificial intelligence and related information technologies. And we are excited to hear more about his work today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chapman to the Wake Forest CARE seminar.
Thank you. I guess I could just get right into what I mean by epistemic habits before I have the rest of my slides. And you write an abstract, and then the slides maybe morph and diverge from what you wrote before, since the abstract comes first instead of last. So epistemic, from like Greek for knowledge, like epistemology. I use it quite broadly for information and data, and the habits are like kind of the technologies we build around ourselves to facilitate our consumption or generation of data, information, and knowledge. And the habits, there's a book that I've been reading called The Entanglement that I think has kind of an interesting way of viewing how research should work, and says, basically technologies create habits, and then, and he's a philosopher, so he's saying philosophy and art challenge those habits, and then then you create new habits. And I think particularly multidisciplinary research serves similar purposes of disrupting and challenging the habits of the different groups that are involved in that research. So I wouldn't want to leave it just to arts and philosophy. Okay. So why my title? Ignorance is certainly an intrinsic, nearly defining aspect of being a patient. I don't talk too much about my patient experiences in this, but I'm kind of rooted in medical informatics because of experiences as a childhood cancer survivor and then long-term chronic care from that. Since this is kind of like first kind of academic or professional trip back to the US, just before I moved to Australia, I submitted an NLM G13 proposal that I entitled Pushing Against Ignorance, an autoethnographic study of how informatics has shaped the culture of healthcare. And actually, moving to Australia has intensified my interest in the different ways we push against ignorance. So hopefully you'll find this viewpoint interesting. So Rescher, who was a philosopher of science at the University of Pittsburgh, wrote a very wonderful book called Ignorance. He has another book called Error. I highly recommend them. They're not too thick, so you can get through them. But it says, ignorance exists because man is a being of limited intelligence and power. Accordingly, there is nothing incidental or fortuitous about our ignorance. It is something deep-rooted in the nature of things. Despite that deep-rootedness, I don't think ignorance is really a common medical term. And people pushed back against me about this title, and they would prefer words like uncertainty. And they're related. Uncertainty and error, they're related, but I think ignorance is really kind of the fundamental concept. We might think of uncertainty as the experience or the awareness of some of our ignorance. And certainly error may be the consequence of ignorance, but certainly there are other causes of error. Rescher makes an important distinction that I'm going to use throughout this talk. He talks about there's invincible ignorance, and that's ignorance that is intrinsically unknowable or beyond the scope of current human knowledge. And so, basic science is a lot of pushing against this, invincible ignorance, trying to, understand the universe better. But he also has this concept of vincible ignorance. I've never heard the word invincible separate from invincible, so my vocabulary expanding here. So vincible ignorance is that which an individual can overcome with a reasonable amount of effort. So that means the knowledge is out there. It's just, it may not be available to you at the moment. And reasonable amount of effort, that's weasel terms, that's, certainly can be adjusted. But I think this is really largely the domain of medical informatics. The knowledge is out there. It may not be at on the mind of the person making the decision. And a lot of what we're trying to do with informatics isn't discover new knowledge, but make the knowledge available at the point to kind of address this vincible ignorance problem. So I thought I would just kind of overview my career and how it relates to this. And there's certainly been a evolution current or drift to that. I started my work in imaging and NLP. So I'm just kind of briefly talk a little bit about this. When I was a young PhD student, I'm getting a doctor of philosophy. I felt like I needed to find my favorite philosopher. And so
we all do that.
I ran across at the time, actually when I was still doing plasma physics, Alfred North Whitehead. And when I was doing my medical informatics work, I read Science in the Modern World. And this was really defining, this really framed how I wanted to view my work. So kind of, an abbreviated version of this, Plato and Pythagoras stand nearer to modern physical science than does Aristotle. The popularity of Aristotelian logic retarded the advance of physical science throughout the Middle Ages. If only the schoolmen had measured instead of classifying how much they might have learned. Classification is necessary, but unless you can progress from classification to mathematics, which earlier he talks about quantification, your reasoning will not take you very far. So I'm doing my PhD in medical imaging, radiology, and I'm thinking quantify. That's what we want to think about. That was not the primary viewpoint of radiology in the 90s. And so a radiologist that I met, a few years later in, job interview talks said, my chair, back in the day said, a radiologist with a ruler is a radiologist in trouble. And I've often wondered about what's this? And, I imagine it's the professional ethos of judgment. Anyone can measure. But it takes a really professional to make these kind of judgments. So my quantification was not mainstream thinking. I wasn't the only, I wouldn't claim I'm the only person in radiology, pushing this. A few years later, at the inaugural imaging, I can't quite remember how CA Big named its different pieces. Yeah. Carl Jaffe, who was a radiologist at Yale and NIH, kind of gave the inaugural talk, and he started right off talking to a bunch of radiologists and imaging scientists. No one in clinical trials takes radiology seriously. And he listed a bunch of reasons why. He said, we all pay for it because you have to, but then we ignore it. And his number one thing was the inability to quantitatively monitor therapy. We don't want to just say bigger, smaller, same. We want to say it was 5.4 and now it's 3.2, so that you can reason more adeptly with the data that you're collecting. And so I think that non-quantitative radiological knowledge might be labeled impoverished knowledge. I'll explain where I get that term later. And I think as a form of vincible knowledge, with a reasonable effort, we could have quantified something instead of just making a qualitative description. Well, I get this impoverished knowledge phrase from Miriam Solomon, who's a philosopher of science, philosopher of medicine. She has a book at Oxford University Press called Making Medical Knowledge. And she kind of talks about, medicine's favorite way of learning is randomized clinical trials. It says often it's not too much of a leap to infer from a RCT that the intervention causes the positive outcome, but the resulting knowledge is rather impoverished. It is knowledge of what works without knowledge of how it works, or why it does not work, or how to make it work better. It is knowledge of effects without knowledge of underlying mechanisms. And to tie in to AI machine learning, I mean, that's a similar kind of thing what you say about black box machine learning. You know something, but it's a rather impoverished form of knowledge. And so most of my work was originally with vascular imaging, and we wanted to be able to take what was really just a matrix of pixels and to break it into semantic parts, and then with those semantic parts quantify the features. And largely we were driven at this time with work around intracranial aneurysms and gene discovery. So we were looking for quantifying tortuosity of the vessels, which might have been related to a collagen or various other defects. We made great progress in the intracranial work. When I tried to port this to like the pulmonary systems, our segmentation segmentation was the starting point, and then once we had a segmentation, then we could start answering interesting questions. We were really had the bottleneck of limited segmentation techniques, and now with deep learning, there's really great opportunity with UNets and other variations of that we can really get good segmentations, and then given good segmentations, then we can start getting quantitative and reasoning with the medical images. That's all I'm going to say about imaging. But I did have an NIH grant for pulmonary embolisms, and you have to know what's in the image, and we don't have that much money. And so we would decide, well, we'll use the radiology report as a label for the image, and so we needed to develop some NLP, information extraction tools, to say, is there something there? How certain are they that there is something there? Where is it? And so my wife, Wendy, who some of you might have met, was an NLP researcher, and so I kind of took some of her preliminary tools that weren't really instantiated, they were more conceptual, and built them into a Python package, and really started in just something to help me with my imaging research, and then this became a tool that was really quite broadly used, and it's been surpassed by superior tools now. Our son actually manages a newer version of this that's part of the I'm blanking on the NLP package out of MIT, Spacey. So there's better tools than this, but this was a nice impact that I think I was able to have in the community. We moved to San Diego, and I met Emil Gentili. He was the chief of radiology at the San Diego VA, so someone that would obviously be someone I would be interested in collaborating with. But his questions weren't images, his questions were text. And so radiology has the important responsibility agreed amongst themselves that if there are certain critical findings that are in the images, we might need to not just dictate them in the report, but directly communicate to the referring physician about this because they're critical. And as part of accreditation, et cetera, and you do auditing to see how well we are doing at reporting these critical findings. So he wanted a way to automatically identify critical findings in the reports and then be able to check how many of those were communicated directly. So basically the task before us was how to have Emil pick up some basic software programming skills so that he can do some kind of scripting. We don't have time to do this work for him. We're just trying to help him. He's not a computer programmer. But it was really kind of a remarkable collaboration, and I could see that not everyone has to have computer science 101, 110, 201. Now that we've moved away from the Fortran C world, the stepping in point is much lower, and he really kind of went with this and ran with it and really became a self-sufficient researcher, or quality assurance, whatever you want to call it, with a little bit of help and collaboration from us with using these Python tools. And so I want to use that to just kind of transition a little bit into educational efforts. Because I was really kind of inspired by my work with Emil and how empowered I felt like we were able to help him become. I got my PhD in medical informatics and had worked, large part of my career within medical informatics departments. If any of you have intersected the informatics world and you ask them what their background is in, there's not a common thread of things. And so if I got my bachelor's in electrical engineering, I went and did a master's in electrical engineering towards a PhD. Almost everyone has a very common background, and even if they're physics or something, it's not too hard to compensate. But I taught psychology students, biology students, music students, and somehow we want to put them into this transfer function, and out comes something that we call, this is a biomedical informatician. So it was already kind of a challenge that I was familiar with. The buzzword at the time now was not biomedical informatics so much as data science, but a similar kind of thing. You're saying people coming from these diverse backgrounds, they want to do data intensive or data related research. Can we, in some short period of time, reasonable short period of time, take them, put them into our little black box transfer function, and out of them comes a biomedical data scientist, clinical data scientist. And so we, how to think about this? Is that even doable? So I'm an electrical engineer by training, and what I did in electrical engineering was electromagnetics. And so searching for my metaphors, how to think through problems, I start thinking about electromagnetics. And what is an electromagnetic wave includes things like radio waves that have wavelengths the size of skyscrapers to X-rays that have wavelengths the size of an atomic nuclei. It's all electromagnetics. But the tools and assumptions I might use vary radically depending where in that spectrum I'm working. If I'm working with an electric circuit, I ignore that it's a wave completely. I use Kirchhoff's current and voltage laws. If I'm working with X-rays, I don't think about it being a wave either. I think of it as being a photon. Working with microwave, of course, I'm concentrating on waves. So the skill sets and tools needed to be productive vary, depending on where I am, yet it's all electromagnetics. And I started thinking about this with data science. So I would go down to the math department and I would talk with a mathematician and he'd say, you can't do data science unless you know linear algebra. Mm. And I don't know that Gil Strain would say that. I just put Gil Strain because he's the linear algebra man, and I think he's great educator. But he's going to view data science as linear algebra. He has a book, linear algebra, learning from data. But at the same time, I had a lot of interactions with Chris Wiggins, who is at Columbia and also the chief data scientist at the New York Times. And to him, a data scientist is someone that takes scikit-learn and scripts some things up to learn something, to make sense of some sort of data. And yet to him, that's still data science. Avi Seidman I think he's retired now, a business professor at University of Rochester. I got him to speak at a AMIA education forum that I was the chair of. And he had created training for CEOs about deep learning. And you can imagine that training for CEOs is even going to be very different from what Chris Wiggins is saying about a data scientist for the new, his objective is how do you help CEOs not be bamboozled by snake oil salesmen coming to their company saying, we've got this great tool. But yet I think it is all data science and different skill sets. And so with Matt Seymour, who is a epidemiologist, infectious disease person at Utah and the Salt Lake VA. We wrote as co-PIs a R25 for short-term training. And we really decided instead of picking one thing that we were going to try to emulate my experience with Emil Gentili. Take primarily clinically oriented people and in 3 weeks impart in them some skills that they can do data I came up with the label punk data science, which I'll explain it. So you don't think I'm just an electrical engineer. I had to come up with another one. So punk data science. Some of you might recognize a very, very young Wendy Chapman there on the left during her graduate work. And so if I say punk data science, you might think, oh, transforming them into these, stereotyped, tattooed, pierced, mohawked students. That isn't what I meant at all, although I did have one former professor at University of Utah say that he would sue me if I ever tried to portray him or his colleagues in this way. But what I mean by punk data science really goes back to the early days of informatics and Homer Warner. So Homer Warner was an MD, got a PhD in the 1950s. And so he's kind of this traditional cardiovascular researcher in the 1950s. But he returns from the University of Minnesota where he did his PhD and sets up a lab at LDS Hospital in Salt Lake City. And I think almost just from the randomness of social connections and friends, he was friends with electrical engineering professor. He starts getting interested in this case, this is an analog computer. He takes some electrical engineering mathematics courses, and he starts teaching himself electrical engineering mathematics. He's never going to design a circuit. He's never going to design something that's going to sell. But he starts taking these electrical engineering skills and applying them to his physiology and his cardiology diagnostic work in novel ways. And that's what I mean by punk informatics. And so why might I apply that? Well, Kevin Dunn wrote this book called Global Punk. And he said, punk is not a narrow musical style or a particular fashion or hairstyle. Rather, it is a commitment to a do-it-yourself sensibility, and with that, a dedication to self-empowerment. So at the musical, the heyday of punk music in the 70s, there's this, famous picture. This is a chord, this is another chord, this is a third chord, now form a band. It's no claim to be a symphony orchestra or whatnot, and some of the punk musicians really were adept musicians, and some went on to learn more, and the more you learn, the more you have at your disposal. But we can get started. We can show you this is a Jupyter notebook, this is an FL statement, this is a for loop. Now, write a program. And that was really the approach we were trying to do, is to empower them. You don't have to be, it's great if you have partners, and eventually as you make sense of your data, you'll want to bring experts in, but you can start exploring and learning and making sense of things on your own. You can have a do-it-yourself attitude. Well, from Utah, we moved, and feel free to interrupt me. There's nothing that if I don't get to the end, there's going to be some, we've really missed out. So if you want any clarification on anything. So let's transition to artificial intelligence. We went from Utah to the University of Melbourne in Australia. And one of my first tasks was to develop a curriculum for the medical students. They were redesigning their entire four-year curriculum. And the dean was very hip on data and AI. And so he wanted all the medical students to come out with a certain level of data literacy. And I'm like, great, I know how to do that. I think I know how to do that. That's my punk informatics, punk data science framework. We can run with that. People like that idea. They were happy with that. The biomedical informatics and artificial intelligence, that felt a little bigger and harder. We were never going to get a lot of time. They gave us 5 hours of the first year student contact time. So how do we constrain what we're going to talk about?
We get 1 hour.
Okay, well, so we were.
So don't complain. I would be very jealous of you.
They gave us 5 hours, but what we learned when we looked at things, they weren't ever tested on anything. So the number of students that actually engaged in it might have been far less than 5 hours. So we decided to narrow the task, and of all the things you could talk about, we decided we're going to focus on the physician as a decision maker. And we were going to motivate artificial intelligence from this perspective. Well, how might I motivate that? Well, about the same time, some researchers at Macquarie University up in Sydney in Australia published this paper, The 3 Numbers You Need to Know About Healthcare. So what they found is 60% of healthcare that is delivered is appropriate, either according to evidence or to the lesser claim of consensus. 30% is just a waste, and 10% is outright dangerous, right? So we're having problems making the right decisions on delivery of care. So that should be something that could motivate medical students. We know there's just an overwhelming amount of information. So I'm a disciple of Larry Weed. And Larry, I heard him say when he visited Utah when I was in graduate school, psychologists proved in the 50s that doctors can't do their job. And what he meant by that was really that line down here, human cognitive capacity. The psychologists did these experiments of the working memory of was that an interruption?
No.
Oh, okay.
All right. Let me open Azure first.
AJ, you need to be muted. Okay.
I thought there was something. Anyway, so the working memory, what the human mind can keep in working memory is 5 or 7 variables. And back in the 60s or 70s or maybe in the 80s, that's really close to the number of facts per decision, but it didn't take long for the amount of information that we think that we should be processing to really overwhelm the human mind. And I really have liked the writings of Andy Clark. He's a cognitive scientist and philosopher. This particular book is called Natural Born Cyborg. And he asks, what are brains good for? So what then is the role of the biological brain? It is expert at recognizing patterns, at perception, at controlling physical actions, but it is not so well designed for complex planning and long, intricate derivations of consequences. It is, to put it bluntly, bad at logic and good at Frisbee. Now, that may be a good argument for a surgeon. Being good at Frisbee may be a good skill set for surgery, but that doesn't really look like the argument for the practice of medicine. Well, he goes on, the human brain is good at, so what is special about human brains and what best explains the distinctive features of human intelligence is precisely their ability to enter into deep and complex relationships with non-biological constructs, props, and aids. This ability, however, does not depend on physical wire and implant mergers so much as on our openness to information processing mergers. So what does he mean by information processing mergers? There are things like paper and pencil to do arithmetic. The math we can do with a paper and pencil versus what we can do in our head, astoundingly different. I wish I had known that when you take the GRE, they don't let you use paper and pencil. That was discovered at the moment I showed up to take the test. That was disappointing. Books for storing and recalling knowledge. So we're outsourcing memory out of our neurons. And then cell phones and computers, or would all be examples of information processing mergers. And this is generally known as the extended mind theory. So we're always using more for our brain, our thinking, than just our biological brain. This is really kind of a similar idea to Licklider, who had an alternative viewpoint about AI. So mainstream AI in the 1960s was all about replicating the human, and he was more back to the cybernetics kind of viewpoint that John McCarthy was trying to differentiate from, of man-computer symbiosis. So he wrote in 1960, the hope is that in the not too many years, human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and that the resulting partnership will think as no human brains has ever thought before. Those of you familiar with Chuck Friedman's fundamental theorem of medical informatics, see that's Chuck's just restating 30, 40 years later, the same idea that Licklider had expressed in 1960. So people have been trying to help clinicians make decisions better with computers for a long time. My students, when I ask, when do you think the first AI in medicine paper was published? So they'll usually say somewhere between 2000 and 2010. And I'll claim, well, it's 1961, which is a Bayesian diagnosis of congenital heart disease with Homer Warner paper. But in England in the 1970s, this research I just learned about this recently, de Dombel, and I don't know what his first initials stand for. I think he was up at Leeds, and he developed an acute aortic pain diagnostic system. with a Bayesian diagnostic system, and it worked remarkably well. Relied on clinical symptoms, and they evaluated it over 2 years, and it outperformed senior clinicians with a correct diagnosis 92% of the time. This is just great. So it's like, this is great, so we should export it. And so they exported it to Denmark, and it failed. Instead of 92%, it's like 65%. And biologically, genetically, the Danes aren't that I mean, the Danes left a lot of DNA in England over the centuries. It's not a biology, it's that the practice of healthcare is just different enough. How you define a disease, what clinics patients go to, what tests are ordered. It just didn't work. Now, it's not just the 1970s that this is happening. So I have a former student that's higher up in Cerner, Australia, and he was telling me about their port of their sepsis detector. Worked great in the US, goes to Australia, it's a complete failure. Australians are not biologically radically different from Americans. I say that of apology to Canadians. But what it was is like the best single predictor, like the most weighted variable in the US was a test that was ordered early on in American medical practice and is rarely ordered in Australia. And so this kind of illustrates, so he concluded that he came up with the phrase, databases don't travel. And this is kind of a realization of what various sociologists of medicine have found, that clinical data are formed, not found. It's not, we're not just listening to your physiology broadcast to us. We are taking specific actions based on assumptions and models of care, et cetera. So that's a challenging thing if we're thinking about the generalization of healthcare, because healthcare is clearly culturally dependent and very context sensitive. And so really the question is, how much generalizable knowledge can be created in healthcare as opposed to physiology, molecular biology, et cetera. So I think this is a really challenging and kind of this clinical endpoint kind of work that informatics is touching on. We're clearly in a data-driven era. When you're in the US, that may not be as big of a problem as other places. I just love the title of this paper. I'm not sure that it's a really great paper, but the US is the big generator of data, and it's the big consumer of that that's going into these language models, or big. Not so much of an issue here, but think about Australia. Clearly, the practice of medicine is different. Their accents are different. And when you only have 26 million people generating data, what does that mean in terms of data-driven AI? Should we just be adapting ourselves to be more like America, or what's the answer? And then what about Norway? 6 million people. Very challenging questions around data-driven AI in less populated kind of settings. And if we think about the Braithwaite paper that I mentioned earlier, if it's only 60% of it is appropriate, do we really want to be building AI tools based on these data? And do we know that it was just the patient's physiology that was going to kill them, not our actions in all these cases? So the data is really kind of problematic. We can probably do better. So this is Alan Morris. He's a critical care physician. I'm sure he's retired by now, out at Utah and Intermountain Healthcare. And he spent his career developing very sophisticated protocols for managing patients, kind of these decision tree, flow diagrams. And later in his career, he got very interested in mathematical physiological models. And so he hooked up with this group, this glucose management, researchers in Denmark created this, 27 couple differential equation model of glucose physiology, and developed a decision support tool based on that. And they showed that was able to achieve better targets than either these sophisticated paper protocols or simple guidelines. So superior performance, and it walks. So they were able to spread this, test this throughout the U.S. and Singapore. And so, going away, getting down into this mechanistic thinking, able to more generalize the results that are making it easier for the database to walk. My next example kind of comes from the fact that not everyone has a lot of doctors everywhere. And even if you have a lot of doctors, doesn't mean you have access to them, as my poorly insured daughter in Florida is continually reminding me. The US is kind of on the lower end of doctors per capita. I think that's engineered market by the AMA. Most European countries are kind of 3.5 to 4. Cuba is an outlier of being really high. But if you look at some of the African countries or Papua New Guinea, it's almost like there's no doctors, right? So you have to think very differently about how healthcare should work and what the kind of AI tools should be for. So Washington Post recently had this article about diagnosing rheumatic heart disease in Africa. And so what they're able to do is AI can guide less nurses to acquire the ultrasound. If you come from imaging, it's like, oh, ultrasound, it's the hardest because it's so operator dependent. So it takes a lot of skill to operate the ultrasound machine. But the AI guides the nurse to do the ultrasound, and they're able to acquire the clinical data that allows them to, make these decisions. And so, break this down, AI is allowing less skilled clinicians to accurately obtain clinical data, in this case, nurses. So you can ask, well, how far can we generalize this? I won't ask this here. It's like, well, does that only have to take place in Africa? Can it take place in developed countries? But what I want to ask is, can we have AI help patients, consumers, citizens, whatever you want to call them, better pursue and achieve their health goals, just like we're helping that nurse do a role that they weren't trained for. And so I move on to AI and the patient experiences, which is largely what I've been working on thinking about for the last couple of years in Australia, and kind of working on the AI end of things last year. And so the framing of this is concept of epistemic injustice. And this comes from Miranda Fricker, who I believe is at NYU. And she talked about this epistemic injustice, or this injustice around knowledge and information and data. Testimonial injustice is where your testimony is dismissed because of who you are. You're not listened to, and I think that actually has quite a bit of traction within healthcare, but it's still certainly a problem. And then hermeneutical injustice is you are kept from understanding your circumstances. And that's, what we were talking about before about my experience and, other people I've not in the talk, sorry, a little aside there within the room that is not going to make sense, but you could understand your circumstances, but for whatever reasons, the data, information, and knowledge for you to understand are kept from you. And so how can AI be used to address these injustices? And so I think to understand this, we have to think about what's the context of the patient experience. So they may or may not have access to doctors. If they do have access to doctors, they may not have very much time with their doctors. So this almost unreadable graph is how long the average primary care consult is. And so at the high end is Sweden and the US, a little over 20 minutes. This is a 2017 British Medical Journal paper. But if you get down here, I zoomed in here. India, I gave a talk to University of Melbourne alumni in India, and I didn't connect. I mean, they said they see 100+ patients a day. They do not have time to use the electronic medical records that they have purchased. And you see here, the average consult time in India, that's 2.5 minutes. Right? So you have limited access, limited time. It's not a great formula for understanding, for that hermeneutical understanding. And also they're very noisy, and noisy in kind of a general sense. There's, different languages. There's the sub-language of medicine that's kind of purposely designed to keep patients out. And so this William Wimsatt, who's wrote this great book, Re-Engineering Philosophy for Limited Beings, we're error-prone and error-tolerant beings. Errors are unavoidable in the fabric of our lives. Cognitively speaking, we metabolize mistakes. So the human mind is really adept at coping with mistakes, and so our engineered solutions also need to be able to metabolize mistakes. And so if I think about AI solutions, I know that the AI solution is going to have errors, so how do we help the patient metabolize those mistakes? So I've been thinking about this in terms of hermeneutical injustice and understanding. So patients have a right to understand their health and their health care. Hermeneutical injustice results in patients experience vincible ignorance, to go back to my other term. If there's some things we just can't know about our disease state. It's just unknowable to the clinician, it's unknowable to us. But vincible ignorance would lead to hermeneutical injustice. And there's substantial, sometimes these are engineered barriers. I talked with people about how difficult it is for me to get access to my medical data, especially compared to the US. And so we've been interested in exploring, can LLMs be beneficial in addressing some of these barriers? Some people just say, well, you just have to ask your doctor. That's not going to be realistic. And the human mind just doesn't wait for information to come to it. So going back to Rescher's book on ignorance, jumping to conclusions over a chasm of ignorance is a natural human tendency from which few of us are exempt. If we have a test result or a test, even if we don't have a result, if we have a test performed and we don't have, 3 months until we can get into our doctor, it's not that our mind's just going to sit there. Later in the book it says, nature abhors a vacuum, so does the human mind. We try not to let the gaps in our knowledge be mere empty blanks, so we fill them in with speculation and suppositions. It's what humans do. And so can AI help patients fill in the gaps better? To go back to another metaphor, can AI help create punk patients? Do it yourself patients. So I've got 3 students I've been working with for the last year on this, 2 on the right at the University of Melbourne, and then Sarah de Graft is in Brussels, and she just really wanted to come down to Australia. So I said, come down and I'll help you get started on this thesis. So, if you start with things like text simplification or summarization of a medical report, these LLMs work great. Even translating into other language. I only speak English, so this is secondhand, but people that have explored it with me say, yeah, simplify it, translate it, very, very good. It's a very constrained problem. You're saying take this chunk of text and render this chunk of text in this different way. Question answering is very much more open, unconstrained problem. And so taking questions, either the one data set that Sarah's using are questions that were emailed or addressed directly to the NLM, or Medline Plus searches and the other things. And then can we come up with good ways of answering this? So LLMs are fairly good at answering, but there is the risk of hallucination and many more issues. And so really what we want to do is, can we constrain the answer, and knowing that the LLMs will fail, can we help the patient metabolize the mistake from the LLM? And so the way that we've been approaching that is with retrieval augmented generation. So I don't think that the LLM always listens to our instructions of only answer from the specified material. But the idea is retrieve materials from reliable sources like PubMed Central, NLM Bookshelf, and only answer it from that. And then we tell the patient where the materials came from, so they have the opportunity to check, did this article really say this, or this abstract really say that? And I should say, really the pain point is the getting specific retrieval. It's not the LLM part, it's the identifying the relevant information. One of the students is exclusively using PubMed abstracts. The other student found that, probably not surprisingly, for answering consumer questions, review articles that are in PubMed Central are a much better source of information, and the NLM bookshelf, we're using Stats Pearls, and I think the NCI PDQ are much better research, still publicly available. They don't have a nice API like Entrées does, but better sources for answering the patient questions. Edward has a really sophisticated system. He has a website, and I was going to show it to you, and he said not to because he's broken it. Now it's providing really bad answers. But it's really kind of been fun to work with him. He's a master's by coursework, so he doesn't get access to any of the university research resources, so he has to pay for it all himself. And the creativity of poverty, instead of just throwing things at giant LLMs or GPUs, he's on every penny. This is coming out of my wallet, and so he's really focused on creating very small resources, very effective resources that don't cost him a lot of money, and then of course would not cost other people a lot of money to run. He's been kind of exploring some novel ways of exploring PubMed to find relevant information. And then focusing on, okay, if we get a review article, LLMs get confused by the more data you send them. They get confused in the middle. They respond more to the middle and the end. So really trying to subtext, down to, get the specific kind of data that you need to make the answer. He's using a multi-agent framework. I'm just going to skip that for the sake of time. And it's really kind of his work, and I wouldn't do it justice in explaining it. So what are the next steps? To me, obviously, we need to constrain this with explicit knowledge representation. It doesn't know, if you ask it a question about Martians, it will try to go find plausible evidence about Martians in PubMed. I ask it, things like, oh, it's well known that survivors of Wilms tumors have higher IQs. Can you explain this? And it goes off and it tries to explain this. So there needs to be constraints on the system. I don't really know how to do that yet, but I think that's going to be an important question. I don't think LLMs are the answer. I think that we're going to start viewing them as components in a larger circuit, and we're going to be building things around them and learning what they're good for and using it for that and using other tools for other things. And then coming up with an efficient and realistic evaluations on a budget is another pain point in this research. And with that, you can't just, I grew up in medical imaging under the influence of Harry Barrett and the dogma that quality must always be related to specific tasks, not just asking someone, does this look like a good answer, but can we test them, like, can they answer, can they answer something with this answer that we've given them? So in summary, ignorance is central to the human experience, including healthcare. Some ignorance is invincible. I think this is a good framework, especially in combination with epistemic injustices for thinking about AI in healthcare. Medical informatics has been a decade, 60, 70-year quest to push against the invincible ignorance in healthcare. There's various mechanisms at our disposal for that, such as quantification, mechanistic thinking, AI, all not as used as much as I think that they could be. Both clinicians and patients can partner with and benefit from these efforts. And getting punk data scientists, punk informaticists, punk patients is getting easier and easier with each generation of AI that comes to us. So I think that there's a lot of future there for us. And with that, I'll end, and happy to address any questions or criticisms the crowd wishes to offer.
Thank you so much. This is great. You really helped us overcome our invincible ignorance.
About some things, about epistemic injustice, at least, I hope.
I'm certainly leaving with a much larger vocabulary. I appreciate that. For those of you who are on WebEx, you can put your questions in the chat, please. Or if you don't want to type the whole question, just put a letter or something, and then we will ask you to turn your microphone and ask your question. Do you have any questions for those of you who are in the room here before we turn to our chat?
Dwayne Godwin sent a question in the chat.
Okay. Dwayne, if you're in a place where you can turn your microphone on, would you like to ask your own question, please? If you can't, we will
Sure.
read your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
So, I really appreciate
Sorry
your
about
talk.
breakfast again. Sorry.
All right, I appreciate your talk, and it's a fun exploration of some of the limitations. The training set for current LLMs seems to me, and I think to others, to be a huge problem because a lot of the training sets currently are on unvalidated information using the internet as a resource, publicly available. Even marketing material sometimes, I think sometimes seeps into it. Gary Marcus proposes that the rate of improvement of LLMs is plateauing, and that people expecting that something like an artificial general intelligence is achievable with LLMs are fooling themselves. I hear what you're saying. I think you're seeing this as more of an augmentation rather than supplanting human intelligence. But there is this problem that I see where unless we constrain training to validated sources, such as PubMed, it seems as though we are still going to be fighting a battle with a public that may not know the difference between good and bad AI, that will be getting bad information that could actually harm patients by the use of these resources without, being imbued with a further understanding of what constitutes a good AI implementation versus a bad implementation of an LLM. So I'll pause there and just let you respond to that.
Yeah, I think the ground truth is a huge problem. And I'm blanking on her name. She's originally from Sydney, Australia, and at USC now, but she gave a great talk as part of the Tanner lecture values on in human values and artificial intelligence. It was hosted at Berkeley 2022 or so. The term ground truth, comes from the 60s, and these very careful satellite things. And I don't think that there's hardly any AI that has really been built on she talks about ImageNet. And, you're labeling someone and it's based on the labels they use are based on WordNet, and they're crowdsourcing it to, someone living on an island in the Pacific. Is this person a racist? Or, whatever. And so for a long time, I think artificial intelligence or data has been far removed from really good grounded data. So that is in general a problem. I think a lot of people are recognizing it. Tom Mitchell, who is AI researcher at Carnegie Mellon, saw him last year at a symposium at the Santa Fe Institute. The large language models had really switched his thinking. He thought you always want to start with domain and then refine. And it's almost like they're so good that maybe we don't want to start with just training on medical text. I don't know if that's the right answer. If we think about what it is, I mean, the large language models are just a giant probability distribution of sequences of tokens. That's why I think that the LLM is not the standalone solution. I don't know that we have to train a sequence of tokens on something, a very narrow domain, if it is just part of a larger circuit that is taken care of. I don't know the solution. I think one thing that we don't think about, that LLMs are really energy inefficient. And Pete Solovich just had a New England Journal of Medicine AI editorial. I saw, it sounded very similar to a YouTube talk I saw of his at MIT a year ago. Very skeptical about how much we should be relying on it when we don't really know how it works, first off. But then he emailed us. We were kind of getting advice about our son's future education. Google kind of has admitted to him like really high failure rate at how often their LLMs fails in getting the correct answer versus search. Like the energy consumption of answering with a knowledge graph versus a search versus an LLM is like orders of magnitude jumps. And so I think that there's a lot of kind of enthusiasm going on that will taper as you learn how to use it and learn what it's best for.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, one of the things I think about with evaluating these new systems is that we need to make sure that we don't get into, there's a chronic problem. I think like in my perspective in informatics is just evaluating a system, but not saying compared with what, right? So, like you think about, the 1950s, right? You had, Prevention Magazine, your doctor, and your grandma, right? And somewhere in between those was some kind of ground truth, right? And then you move forward, and then now you had Google and your doctor and your grandma and maybe Prevention Magazine, right? And your next door neighbor or whatever, or an online forum, right? And now you got all these new tools, but is it just adding complexity without refining things, or was it doing? But I mean, it's true in medicine too, right? So like, it goes back to the sort of dealing with uncertainty. Sometimes when we create guidelines, right, if there is no clear data, we just say, I don't know. And then but alternatively, other guidelines would fill in the blank. So we've had like cardiology guidelines from different groups that have been in wildly disagreement, but it's just the approach to the areas where there's grayness. But I mean, I think it's really important for us to think about, like, all this information. It's not going to be a super high quality, but what's it compared with some
Right.
alternative state?
Right.
And so Sheila, the only comment is that Sheila Cotton works in the geriatrics and technology space, and she talks about, like, it's really hard to train, particularly older adults, which is a lot of our patients, to evaluate the quality of data, right? So I almost think, like, could we have like, you work with an AI that works with the AI, right? So that helps you filter, or like explains, like, well, I tell you what the AI said, but well, the data is it's not great. So just but yeah, so I think we need, our patients sometimes need help interpreting the quality of the information.
So I think that first off, we have to be realistic about what the alternative is. The alternative is not, well, I just go talk to Stephen and he tells me what the answer is. So they're going to be doing something. And is this better than whatever the default something is, not what our ideal something is? Currently, AI is banned in the state of Victoria in healthcare. I don't quite know what that means. But one of the things is, okay, people think about using an LLM to write a discharge summary. Well, what's the reality? Is it just that you're asking some third-year medical student to go write a discharge summary? Maybe we don't assume it's the attending physician that's giving all his time to this task, and then this is the alternative. When I didn't really emphasize it, but the work that Edward is doing, he does a very good job of, like, putting the links in to the articles that it was allegedly used to answer. So this, you can, that's kind of the metabolizing error. Can you check that this is actually talking about that? And that it's in a context, right? When I talk to my friends, I have a friend whose father-in-law, stepfather is in the ICU dying. The LLM, what I'd say is, okay, how are you're gonna have 3 minutes with your doctor. How are you gonna maximize what the best questions to ask are? And I think that the LLMs can help in, like, you understanding that article. The LLM is not going to order I think that we typically think of the patient doctor relationship as a knowledge difference. I don't think that's the primary thing, because every doctor will treat someone that knows more than they do at some point. Well, maybe not a pediatrician, but others. It's really the legal. This person is legally authorized to order interventions or whatnot, and knowledge differential might be a part of that. But you are working with your doctor who is going to be taking action, and how can you best engage in that? And everyone's going to have mistakes. The doctors are going to have mistakes, and we need to be aware of that. But I think like you were saying, what's the honest comparison of what's it's replacing?
Thank you. We are at the end of our allocated time. Let's thank our speaker one more time.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then if you're another member, please become a member. And then look forward to seeing everybody June 28th. We have a workshop that's coming up, and then that's going to be exciting. Look forward to seeing everybody in our next meeting. Thank you.
Thanks.